This is a Niche Radio podcast. Subscribe to this podcast on iTunes or log into www.nicheradio.co.za.
Welcome to SuperDads. The doctor is in. Today we have Dr. Jack Kruse. He's not everyone's cup of tea, I'm told, but he is definitely is a coffee wake-up call for many. He is a well-respected neurosurgeon and quantum biologist, which we're going to cover in the show. He is published in respected dental and medical journals, using the fundamentals of physics to explain biology. His site, jackkruse.com, has over 250,000 unique visitors from around the world. He is unique in his practicing surgeon, but also has a very informative and educational, engaging site, forum, webinars, and Patreon blog. His focus and testament is preventing his patients from seeing them on the operating table. And if they do, he has a host of Mito-Hacks to accelerate their recovery and help turn their life around. What is a Mito-Hack? Well, Dr. Kruse is a mitochondriac, and what we are going to cover in the show with some stories, physics, and biology. Jack is also a SuperDad, and the reason is because over a decade he encountered his own personal failures. He was about over 160 kgs, was a low dopamine asshole, as he's described himself in the past, and a skeptic. But he encountered a personal injury and received a sincere helping hand with some information that catalyzed a change in his DNA. He might have had to lose 35 kilos in 3 months and 65 kgs in 11 months. He learned that medicine industry has 99.9% of us believing it's all about diet and exercise. However, he explains using physics that is quite the opposite. He's taken steps not only to protect and save himself, but also his wife and children by changing their environment and their practices. His goal is for people to get the science right so that they can get better. His approach comes from a place of enormous love and care, because to take that time and assertiveness to try and help you and make it better, he makes sure that you get the message right. That is what a great friend does. That is what a great father does. And very importantly, that is what a great husband does. So Jack, thank you so much for being on the show. I understand that, you being in front of tech and me, it's slowly killing us. And you taking the great practice of making sure that you're having AM sunlight to get you balanced for the day. Me, I had a nice CT session this morning in the ocean, some fresh mussels, and some other sunlight. But thank you so much for being on the show and generating this donation of your time.
No problem, anytime.
So first question, just to help our listeners out there. So just give us a brief thing of what is mitochondria, what is a mitochondriac, and you explain to be a good mitochondriac, there's 6 physics principles and 3 biology elements that one has to know really well.
Yeah, well, I guess the best way to describe what is a mitochondria. Mitochondria is a part of the cell that the type of cells that are in humans are called eukaryotic cells. We stole a mitochondria from a bacteria, and bacteria is known as a prokaryote. What does this prokaryote do in us? Over the last 65 million years, we effectively deleted most of its genes so that there's only 37 genes in it. And it now is known as the powerhouse of the cell. Most people know that mitochondria make ATP, but where the story flips for my black swan mitochondriacs is most people believe that with the powerhouse of the cell, that it should be tied to food. It turns out that the input to mitochondria is electrons and protons. In fact, the input is called electron chain transport. Most people don't think about foods in this way. So what I do is I force people, and force is the correct word, to come to my level. I will not sink to theirs, because most of the food gurus that are out in the world, they try to explain this process through carbohydrates, proteins, and fats, which are the macronutrients that most people who are going to listen to this are much more familiar with. most people aren't familiar with electrons and protons. And unfortunately, most people are always looking for the drive-through or easy way out of things. So that's why they stick with the things that they know instead of learning the things that matter. And it turns out the things that matter most are how a mitochondria handles electrons and protons, because that's really what determines what your metabolic rate is in different tissues. It determines many different facets of your biology. And in fact, it determines the color of our skin, where we live on the planet. And if we can re-engineer something called our haplotype that we inherit from our mothers, we can use these really novel kind of things to help reverse diseases that I was taught in medical school that we can't reverse.
No, I mean that, and then sort of what is to reverse that process? I mean, to understand, to be a mitochondriac, what are those 6 fundamental physics principles that one should learn to engage to learn really well, that they can learn from your site?
Well, I wouldn't go into all 6 of them because we're going to bore the hell out of people who are listening to this. But what I would say is you need to learn a lot about electrons and protons, and then you also need to learn about the force that controls electrons and protons. And it turns out electrons have a negative charge, protons have a positive charge. The force that controls charged particles is called the electromagnetic force. And it really turns out that's what mitochondria are actually expert in. They are the ultimate physicist inside the cell. And when you begin to understand how scale changes how the electromagnetic force works, then you begin to realize how things work. The other big thing that one of the key physics principles that one needs to know is you need to know that water that comes out of your tap isn't the water that your mitochondria makes. And that is also a very counterintuitive point for many people to understand. In fact, most people listening to this may not even know that your mitochondria makes water. That's the reason why camels have humps. It's the reason why snakes can live in the desert, because they turn fat directly into CO2 and water. And it turns out that water in the cytosol and the matrix of the mitochondria has an extremely important part in this whole story about how mitochondria work with the key biochemical processes that occur within the mitochondrial matrix, which are namely the TCA cycle or the Krebs cycle, which probably most people have heard of. They probably don't know exactly what it does. And the other one is called the urea cycle, which helps us handle proteins in our body. And I can't really say to you that there's keys, okay? The keys are you need to know about those factors. I always tell people, I think the better question for you to ask me, what's the real key? It's called the 3-legged stool. And the 3-legged stool means light, water, and magnetism. And you need to know those 3 inside and out to get to a mitochondriac level. Where it becomes a black swan mitochondriac level is when you begin to add all the other little different things. Like if I was to tell you and your listeners that what's the single most important thing for longevity in your life, and if I told you it happens to be your network of people that are around you, most of you wouldn't believe it. But guess what? Turns out that's really important. And the people that are around you, if they tend to be toxic, you're better off walking your life alone without them in it. And I don't care if it's your mother, your father, your brother, your wife, your sister. It doesn't matter who they are. If they are energy vampires, that has a detrimental effect on your mitochondrial function. And this has been borne out in the literature over the last 20, 30 years. In fact, there's a TED Talk out about that very effect that stunned people. It's been the number one thing that has showed up across research lines, that the 5 or 6 people that are closest to you are very critical into how long you're going to survive. So if you tolerate assholes in your life just because they're related to you, or because they happen to be your kids, and say they're drug addicted and, basically overall shitty people, then that's on you.
No, and you're absolutely right. I mean, I had with my own failures where, I had the wrong people around you. My mitochondria took a knock. Then I was in the media, and then I was getting death threats and all sorts of other issues. And it set me into a tipping point into hospital. And if it wasn't for my wife, I would have been in a very early grave. So it makes a very key thing to have those key people that are going to help prop you up. But I mean, and the also thing is that you can also grow your own network, and this comes with being a dad and having your own family. You're raising your children becomes your closest companions. However, we have this issue with children where there's different types of non-native EMF. We have the blue light, we have the wireless frequency or light, and we have magnetic fields. Although literature tends to be very discriminatory with it, and you've been quite subjectively showing them that exposing to a child to non-native EMF, you would consider as child abuse. And I was hoping you could explain sort of from a quantum biology and, from blue light, magnetic fields and RF, sort of, how does this have an effect on a child's mitochondria, their neurological, abnormal brain function, opioid addiction issues, and the emotions?
Yeah, that question, we probably could spend a whole hour just talking about that alone. To answer the question appropriately, I'm going to have to assume that your audience knows a lot more science than they probably do. But from 2003, I made a prediction, and I just did a really big talk in Vermont in 2018 that ties to this subject. I believed as a hypothesis in 2003 that blue light was the single number one driver of most of the mitochondrial diseases that we've had in the 20th and 21st century. The reason I made that prediction is in 1999, we found in the eye a receptor called melanopsin. Melanopsin happens to be the blue light receptor in the eye. It's operational at dusk when bright sunlight decreases its power. That's what turns on the melatonin clock in your eye. And it turns out the way melanopsin works, all opsins in the human body are bound to something called vitamin A. Vitamin A has a name in the literature called retinol. So that bond is together. Here's the interesting part about that bond. It's a very weak covalent bond, meaning that it's easy to break. And why is it easy to break? It goes back to this paper in 1998 that came from the eye. Blue light able to break that covalent bond. So if you remember back in 1998, we were at 0G, maybe 1G in most parts of the world in terms of the internet's power and what it was working. Well, as we've ramped that up, blue light is no longer my key focus. Now I'm worried about non-native EMF because it turns out it has the ability to break that covalent bond. So why is this a big deal? Well, in 2003, which was 4 years after the paper was done, I started to read a lot of papers that made me realize that, and some of these papers were really, really unusual, where they would take animals, specifically mammals who are nocturnal, take their eyes out or sew their eyes shut, yet they still had the melanopsin effect. What did that tell me as a black swan mitochondriac? It told me that the third eye was buried somewhere in the skin, okay? We had no proof that this was true, but I knew from all the papers that I read that the researchers kept finding this in a myriad of different papers, but none of them were willing to make the leap of faith or the hypothesis, like a scientist would do from direct observation, that more than likely that we had to have other photoreceptors that were not tied to vision that were in our skin. And why was this a big deal in terms of my idea? The skin happens to be the largest connection or largest organ in the human body. And most people, I don't think, are aware of that implication. That means that if your skin truly is the third eye and contains melatonin, I should say contains melanopsin, that it is the major driver of something in the body. We know that in the eye, melanopsin is the key driver for the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is the clock that controls the central retinal pathways. That's the main controller that controls every other. Most of your listeners may not know that in front of every human gene, in fact, in front of every mammalian gene, is a peripheral clock gene. So in other words, we have the central clock gene in the eye and the peripheral one. So back in 2003, my belief was blue light controlled the one in the eye, but I believe blue light also controlled the peripheral clock genes in the skin. But I had no way to prove it. So let's fast forward all the way to 2014. 2014, I read a paper that showed that melanopsin was found in the arterioles of the skin in the dermal layer. And I was like, could this be it? I read those papers, read, the offshoots of those papers, and I was like, this is important, but it's not the key controller. Well, I went to Vermont in 2016 and gave a lecture that you can find on YouTube about how photosynthesis controls food, meaning that it's an electromagnetic barcode for it. Then I went to Vermont last year in 2017 and talked to them about the eye, how the eye is the main controller for obesity. Well, that was in June of 2017. Don't you think 6 months later, the key paper comes out in December of 2017 that shows melanopsin is not only in the blood vessels, it's in the skin and the subcutaneous fat. And it was at that point that I had the keys to the kingdom. I realized right then and there why, since about 1980, 1985, all the NHANES data that we see in the United States took a huge shift, and why it's a big effect. Because modern humans now live indoors 90 to 95% of the time under the effect of blue light. Since 2003, I realized that it got even worse because now we increased network power. Now we're up to 4G and 5G. And I knew that this bond was a weak covalent bond, that it also could be broken. So to getting back to your original story, if you're following this, you asked me a question about kids. What's the difference between kids and adults? Well, it's pretty simple. They have smaller heads, their brains are smaller, they're immature, so they can fit out a vagina, okay? How does nature do that? It actually takes the myelin, which is the outside insulators of neurons, away. That's the reason why children can't speak, they can't walk. They're basically a big fat bundle of goo when they come out. And the reason why they're fat also ties to this story about myelin. Turns out that we create a laser light in our skin with the power of the sun. We use that fat to break down the CO2 in water to myelinate the brain. So what does it mean for children? It means while the brain is being myelinated, it takes from the time they come out of the vagina to about 25 years old to have a full myelinated brain. That's the reason why kids in the United States are not allowed to rent cars until they're 25 years old, because they don't make good decisions until the brain is fully myelinated. Well, what does all this dance mean that we're going through? It means that children are very sensitive to both blue light and non-native EMF because their electrical insulation in their brain is not protected. So how does this scale back to the story that I just told you about melanopsin? Well, the key is melanopsin is bound to this vitamin A. The vitamin A cycle is controlled in the brain. What does the vitamin A cycle link to on the skin? The vitamin D cycle. See, vitamin A and vitamin D protect each other. And the reason why this scales back to the child is we have a tissue called neuroectoderm. In other words, everything that's skin-derived, everything that's brain-derived, comes from that embryologic tissue in your body. So this is how the brain and the skin talks to each other, and melanopsin is one of the key controllers of that. So when you have too much blue light in a child, because you use the iPad for the babysitter, or you put the child in front of a TV or a computer screen, or you buy one of these stupid toys that emits radiation or blue light, you're effectively causing brain damage to your children. How does it occur? The vitamin A breaks free of the melanopsin. As vitamin A drops, guess what happens? You lower melatonin levels. What does melatonin do in the human body? It has one major effect. It controls mitochondrial DNA. See, people in medicine believe that all diseases are tied to nuclear DNA changes, meaning mutations. That comes from Francis and Crick and Darwin. To me, that's total bullshit, okay? And the reason why it's bullshit is we have two genomes in our body. We have a mitochondrial DNA and we have our nuclear genome. It turns out the way this system works is that changes in the mitochondrial DNA is what causes the genetic expression in the nuclear DNA, which is the DNA that you inherit from your mom and dad. So the key for life and nature is to control the mitochondrial DNA. Here's where the story gets even more interesting. We have extreme control of mistakes that occur in the DNA and the nuclear side. It's literally, we only have maybe 0.005 chance of having a mistake in that DNA because we have such strong repair programs. Well, guess what controls the repair programs in mitochondria? Melatonin. And melatonin has two major pathways that it controls: apoptosis and autophagy. Again, these are big words, but what autophagy does, it recycles mitochondrial DNA. Apoptosis is cell suicide. That's when the cell's so defective, we just get rid of it. Now, certain cells need to have apoptosis. For example, the gut lining cells are designed to be replaced every 24 to 48 hours. But what's not designed to be replaced is stuff in your brain, like your neurons. If you did that, you're going to wind up with a neurodegenerative disease, or if it happens in your eye, you're going to wind up with a disease like AMD, which is acute macular degeneration, the #1 cause of blindness in the world. So when you begin to understand that blue light is capable of doing this through these two eyes and your third eye on your skin, you begin to realize that's the reason why melatonin levels drop. And when melatonin levels drop, what does that mean? It means that you lose control of the two repair programs of mitochondrial DNA. When mitochondria don't work good, a process occurs called heteroplasmy. Heteroplasmy means that your Ferrari engines in your cell now are Nissan Sentras. And I don't know how that's going to fly in South Africa because I don't know what kind of cars you have.
No, we have them here. They are here.
So the issue is the effectiveness of those two programs drop. And when the effectiveness of those two programs drop, that means that's the stimulus to turn on protein translation from the nuclear DNA. That process is controlled by something called ubiquinin. Ubiquinin also is a circadian controlled mechanism. So guess what? It pays attention to this melanopsin system. So you begin to realize when you hear this story laid out that everything is controlled via the skin and your eye. And this is decidedly different than what you're taught in medical school because they believe the things that happen in the biochemical pathways in a biochemistry book is the only way things work. And it turns out that's not true. It turns out incident light on your skin and your eyes actually turn on and turn off these pathways below, and that's really determines what happens. So when you put a kid in front of an iPad or a computer terminal to be a babysitter, it's akin to taking that kid into a Walmart in the United States and kicking the shit out of the kid and letting everybody watch. But see, nobody understands that analogy because they don't understand exactly what I just explained to you, that that's effectively what you're doing below the cell level. And this is the reason why kids now are becoming depressed. They have mood disorders. They kill themselves. They shoot people at other schools. Why they have ADHD, why autism showed up out of the blue in the 1940s when we started with TV in the United States. People don't understand how germ cells in mom and dad can lead to childhood cancers. You know why? The answer is very simple. We've always had melanopsin in our skin. So it turns out what happened to mom and dad's skin controls what's going on with the germline in the ovary and in the testes. So when you get two bad germ cells together, that's how a child can be born with a childhood cancer or type 1 diabetes or some other mitochondrial disease. But the problem is the paradigm of belief that's in medicine and the paradigm of the belief that's in researchers do not understand how mitochondrial biology works with these surface photoreceptors that are tied to non-vision. That's how big a deal this is.
No, and like I said, the whole point of your site is that for people to understand the science, so they can explain this instead of just saying, "Look, this paper said it's bad." But I mean, one of our listeners is Commissioner Mhlante. He's the commissioner for the Human Rights Commission of South Africa. And when I was engaging with him during my thesis, he's he's visually impaired and he's working more on the social aspects. But a key statement he made was, if you can present evidence that this non-native EMF and blue light is child abuse, then he, as part of the Human Rights Commission, to Parliament, will take action and put these protection mechanisms in place.
Yeah, I don't believe that guy, just so you know that. And I'll tell you the reason why I don't believe that guy is because the entire economy of the world is based on technology. And the single number one thing that has to happen before this guy comes off his high horse, because that's total bullshit. When I hear total bullshit, I call bullshit out. This will never change. Why? He doesn't have the power to change it. And the reason why, the power is going to come from technology companies. I can tell you the easiest number one thing that everybody needs to mandate, if he was serious about what he wants to do, he needs to go to Microsoft and Apple and tell them from now on, any screen that's sold in South Africa needs to be red lit, not blue lit. And this is a very simple change. That'll help. Now, it still won't help the non-native EMF and the other parts of the spectrum.
Yeah.
So, it's what I call a small help. It's kind of like when in doctor world, when we tell people, if you go from filtered cigarettes to unfiltered, or I should say from unfiltered cigarettes to cigarettes, it's better, but it's still not going to lead to the change we want. The key thing that people need to understand, and I want you to understand this, and I want your audience to understand it, especially this guy, if he's one of your listeners, I want him to listen to this. Change, on a mitochondriac's perspective, doesn't happen from the government. Change happens because you realize the science is true and you change your life. You cannot wait for any government industry or any government to change your life. You have to protect yourselves. You don't have time to waste for those idiots to get the message. Why? Because let me tell you something. All these studies that I just shared with you have been published in the literature since 1998.
Correct.
Why have they all had their head up their ass for this long? Let me tell you why. Because industry spends money to make sure that nobody sees where the pieces fit, nobody connects the dots. Politicians have a vested interest in not understanding, or at least spreading it out so that way corporations can make a lot of money, okay? And for anybody to think that some guy in the government is going to help them, that includes your country and it includes mine, is an epic waste of time. And I want everybody to remind everybody listening to this just how serious this is. I look in my country, Steve Jobs is looked at as a pretty famous guy. I look at him as one of the worst human beings that has ever stepped foot on this planet, and I think he got taken out exactly the way he should have been taken out, like pancreatic cancer, by putting that damn laptop on his lap and the iPhone in his pocket. That's the reason why he succumbed to it. And let me just tell you something so you understand it. He knew what he was doing. Do you know why? He never let his children use his own technology. What does that tell him? He's okay selling it to the rest of the world, but he's not okay letting his own kids use it. Bill Gates the same way. That should tell you something. We have Bill Gates over in your neck of the woods in Africa now trying to change policy on a variety of different areas. All those policy changes are designed so that people, when they get enough money in Africa, start to use his technology to make them sicker. Let me just tell you something. You need to stay as far away from man's progress as possible. You need to reconnect. The thing about your continent that's pretty amazing, this is where humans began. And if you think about it, there was no Google, there was no Microsoft, there was no Apple 6 million years ago at the East African Rift. Where there was 3 tectonic plates that moved up and down, moved the sea in, isolated a bunch of primates that began to eat seafood under the strong power of the light, under extreme powers of the magnetic field. That's what created the human brain. Guess what? It was under the power of nature, not the power of man's use of light technology to help us communicate. And believe me, technology is doing amazing things. It's allowing you and I to talk from 2 continents right now at 2 different time zones. So it does have a benefit, but we need to realize that when it replaces our place in nature, it destroys us.
And I mean, that's the key thing about this show. It's and the whole aspect of, creating this culture of super dads is that the power doesn't fall in government or the ideal illusion of a state that's going to protect you. It comes from you as a father, as a husband, as a dad, as a person, to learn the science and learn understanding yourself so that you can create protection for you and your environment. And then that creates that cultural change through social interaction to propagate it further. And, it's not always easy to sort of do these changes yourself. I mean, even from my personal experience, I have my neighbor, and he periodically was switching on his LTE or 4G and Wi-Fi router. But what happened was the place he put it was right against the wall, and it was through a localized hotspot and jump conduction, was creating like a bouncing effect within our home. And normally before I'd ask him, he said, no, you'll switch it off. But this time he had to put it on again. He was keeping it on for work. And on that same day, I mean, we knew it was on because I was getting the headaches. I was having pain in my gums. I was having abscess in my gums. My wife was getting headaches. And more importantly, my daughter, she wet herself, which she never does, and then again in the evening. So within 24 hours, I went out to the store, bought a bunch of heavy-duty tinfoil, and managed to shield up the wall and reflect it back. And then everything was back to normal in generality. But like you said, it's the thing of going from a filtered to unfiltered cigarettes, only a small part. And the key part is working on that redox potential instead of detoxing. And so that's why, as a father, as a super dad, the idea is to implement these protection mechanisms or cultural practices. And, the part of the thing is that, as a husband, men want to be team partners. And what we find out in South Africa, I don't know if it's the same in the US, but the culture here is that the guy is just, he's the seed donor, he's the sperm, he injects his wife, she then becomes the incubator, and, he mustn't be part of the whole pregnancy process. He's fine to do the social courting beforehand, but during he must sort of stay away. And even sometimes the wives create this artificial barrier where they don't want the husband to be, a part of the pregnancy and protection at the ins and outs, and sort of keeps them in bay. So, from your experience as a dad and what you teach to your family and to your listeners, sort of what kind of implementations can one at SuperDad put in his own household and sort of look after himself before, during, and after the pregnancy, so that he can be that team member to his wife, and instead of being, a back parent, and when he wants to rather be a co-parent?
Yeah, you're not going to like my answer because I completely disagree with just about everything you just said.
All right.
I teach my members one thing: you are not good enough for anyone else until you're good enough for yourself. So how did it happen in my house? I changed me first back in 2005, 2006, when I assimilated the science. The first person that adapted to me was my son. My son looked at what I did to myself, and he's like, Dad, and at the time he was 15 years old. He said to me, can you teach me how to do this? He came to me. Here's the key. No one is ready to change until they're ready to do it themselves. I can't change anyone. They have to be ready for the change. So here's where the story gets instructive for you. You would think my wife, who watched this whole process in me develop over 5 or 6 years, would have got the message like that. Turns out it took her 7 years to get the message. And do you know why she initially got the message? This is not a pleasant thing to admit about your wife on a video, but around 2007, I had a locksmith come in and change all the locks in my house, and locked my daughter and my wife out of the house for a week. She had to go live with her mom and dad. And I told my wife this one thing. I said, Sandy, I'm okay if you want to kill yourself, but I'm not okay if you want to kill my daughter, Callie. At the time, my daughter was small. She was only about 7 or 8 years old, and she was going down the wrong path because what does the daughter do? She watches mom. And I told my wife, I said, until you get this message, I'm never going to be able to fix Callie, because I realized that I ruined both of my kids by doing the things that I was doing to them. My son I already fixed, but he came to me. He was much older. He could reason himself. So my wife eventually got the message. Why is this story important for you? What was the focus of the 2017 Vermont talk? It was my wife's change. I showed her before and her after. Now that my wife is completely on board, for about the last 10 years, she's led to a huge change. I don't know the conversion for kilos, but my wife exactly had the same effect. She went from around 240 pounds. Right now she weighs about 113 pounds, and she's postmenopausal. So the women who are out there say, you can't do this after you have your period or after you lose your period. That's bullshit too. But the key thing is, now my daughter, who's 18, now sees mom, and now my daughter is changing her behaviors. All of her girlfriends in school now are asking my daughter, why do you do this? Why do you do that? The kids want to come over to our house and they want to see what we're doing. Like, we just bought a farm on the north shore of the lake here, which is kind of where I'm going after I finish with you. And the key is that gets the kids outside, away from their cell phones and this and that. All of our friends want to come over and spend time doing these things. See, you have to be the change that you want to see in the world. And I'm going to tell you, you cannot convince your kids or your wife to change. You need to understand this really is an N=1 game, and you have to get the message first and foremost. A super dad is selfish. A super dad takes care of themselves first so that he can tend to the rest of his flock later, because guess how humans learn best? Not being told what to do, but you show them what to do. And then when their dopamine levels start to come up, that's when they start to realize that there is a huge connection between their connection with nature. See, the problem is you have to sever the connection with technology, because what does that do? It lowers that chemical in your frontal lobes called dopamine. Dopamine is exactly how you get motivated to change. And those are called reward tracks. It turns out those are the same tracks that make us fat. Those are the same tracks that affect our mood. Those are the same tracks that lead to most mental illnesses in the frontal lobe. That's the reason why, at least in the United States, we have the opiate crisis. When your dopamine level is low, because you can't make dopamine in your eye, you want to shoot up heroin or use some other drug to offset what you've lost in your eye. The number one key thing is get those people back in nature, and guess what? Their use of drugs will drop. The problem is, the United States, our government has their head up their ass. They don't understand how this chemical in the eye works called POMC. And this data, just so you know, has been in the literature over 50 years. Instead, they focus in on political solutions because they're social. That is an epic fail. An epic fail. Anybody who tells me they want to change things through social engineering, they are not a black swan mitochondriac, and they're not people you should listen to. Okay? Everything is about quantum biology. Everything is about the physics. And once you understand it, you can have huge changes in people. The thing is, you can't force the change in those people. And the hardest thing to do is when you have a low dopamine human, is getting them to see the light. And I mean that literally and figuratively. That's the reason why seeing the sunrise and turning all the lights off after dusk is imperative, because these are the levels. There are different changes that people can do. If I can get them in the sun at the right time of the day and their dopamine levels start to creep up and their redox potential gets better, then guess what they ask me the next time? What's the next thing to do? What's the next thing to do? And believe me, there are layers to this onion, as you well know. But I completely reject the premise that you gave in the question. It is not about trying to change anybody in and around you. It's about you changing you. And then the people that rely and care about you then are going to come to you and say, why are you doing this? What's the angle? Then you explain it to them in an easy way. You don't have to explain it to them Jack Kruse's way, because my way is always going to be the scientific way. When I did it with my son, when I did it with my nephew, when I did it with my wife, I didn't go into this huge elaborate scheme that I just did with you when you asked me that question about melanopsin, because the science is really hard for people to get. But what I try to explain to people, like on your continent, we don't have to teach lions and hippos, quantum biology. Why? Their instincts when they come out of the vagina is they live by nature's rules. We're the only animal on this planet that doesn't. Why? Because we have a quantum computer in our head that allows us to break all those rules. And we don't realize that that's what separates us from the animals. The animals live by nature. Now, the animals in the United States don't, because we put them in zoos, because we don't have, a continent like you guys have. But even in Africa, it's a problem. There's a huge issue with, wildlife in Africa right now. And the reason that problem exists is because zoo humans who live in cities think they know better than nature. And that's the real problem. So I will never give in to a political or social situation when it comes to nature. The nature is the one bias, and I will tell you this. It is a bias that every living system on this planet has to have. Most people come to this, we need to have full diversity and this and that. Bullshit. There's one bias that we all have. No matter if you're black, white, Chinese, Japanese, you are biased to nature's rules. And that means you need to connect wirelessly with the earth and the sun, just as the Sphinx does on your continent in that northwest corner in Egypt. That's the reason why the Egyptians were very, very smart to build the Sphinx. All four extremities grounded with the eyes looking to the east. I would venture to say there's a lot of people on your continent that don't even realize why the Sphinx was really built.
Correct. I really appreciate the answer here, because it was a loaded question. Actually, the question originally came from my wife. And, the story of your wife and how she's transformed with the pictures is, I think you got a new wife because she looks amazing now. She looks younger, she looks fitter. You're very, very fortunate.
It's not about how she looks. What it's about is what I told you before.
Correct.
Her change is going to lead to the sculptor change in my daughter. And that's the message that my wife got. See, all the collateral effects that women like, the vanity issues, to me, I don't even think if you were to ask my wife that right now, that it means nothing to her. What means everything to her is that we're now giving the tools to our kids so that they understand how the modern world that we've brought them into is built to kill them. And that's the key. It's going to harm them. If they use technology the way kids in the United States use technology, I will tell you, when I see kids out right now, like we went to dinner last night in New Orleans, we had two tables on either side of us with kids around us. They were sitting right across from each other, texting over a phone.
Yes.
They didn't even talk to each other. And I was sitting there and I'm going, this is incredible. And this is what our world's become. We have Twitter, we have Facebook, we have Instagram, we have Snapchat. The kids are all addicted to Snapchat. This is the thing. When I was young, growing up in New York City, I played baseball, I played football, I was outside all the time. Where I got sick was actually from my job. Being a shift worker, working at night under blue light, taking care of people's spinal cords, backs, and brains. And the thing is, that change happened for me very, very quickly. Everything I did right when I was a kid completely got taken away within that 10 or 15 years of going through my training. And the thing is, if I didn't realize this back in 2003, 2004, and 2005, when I was putting together this thesis about how we really work, I would have been just like everybody else. Now, I'm pretty forceful. Like when you opened up this talk and you said about me, because it's very accurate, I'm not everybody's cup of tea. I'd rather be their wake-up call. Yeah. And that's what this is all about for me. This, to me, is if you don't care about yourself, I have no care for you either. The thing is, that's how nature works. That's what evolution does. It takes things out that are living very, very quickly who don't follow her rules. And the problem is we need to get that message loud and clear. This is the reason why we see the diseases that we see. And the thing is, believe it or not, you're probably the last continent in the world that has the ability to see these things. I just gave this talk that I gave in Vermont, actually, you may be interested in this because I'm sure you didn't see the talk.
It was released 2 days ago on your site. Yeah. I
I did it a couple of days ago on my site, but something relatively amazing happened that's tied to your continent. The people that were scheduled to talk with me, I was the person that closed the talk out. But there was a gentleman there named Jeff Lech, and he's a researcher from Texas that spends most of his time with the Maasai and the Hadza in equatorial Africa. And one of the things that he just published in Science, which is a big journal here, is that when he gave the Hadza anything to eat, like shit on a shingle is what we call it here, when he gave them antibiotics, when he gave them things that normally would destroy most people in the United States, he found by checking their microbiome and their poop that nothing changed for the Hadza. And their thesis was that when you eat things, it will change how the microbiome reacts. And Jeff from the States said, we now know this isn't true. This paper is actually published in Science from your continent. Do you know what I said from the stage during my talk? I said, Jeff, what else doesn't change in equatorial Africa? From sun up to sun down, the sun never changes. That's what makes the equator special. And I said, Jeff, the key is that the sun is what controls the growth of the microbiome. It's what controls everything about it. So this is the reason why the Hadza can eat honey and do things that people at the 28th latitude in New Orleans can't do. Why? Because the sun is subtropical where I live. Right now, where I am, this is how the Hadza live all the time because it's very, very hot here. It's 98 Fahrenheit, which for you guys is probably like 42 Celsius.
Yeah.
And the humidity is through the roof. It's much, much hotter here than it probably is even in equatorial Africa. But the difference is when we go to the winter months, which you guys are in now, then things change. Then it really changes. See, for the Hadza, it never changes. The sun is the same in the morning and the same at night as it always is, because as you come closer to the equator, the solar incidence relatively changes. There's only wet and dry seasons on the equator. The thing is, that's not true when you go further away. That change is actually coded for in your mitochondria. And the reason why this is important, the other speaker who's at Vermont, a guy named Zach Bush, who's a physician, he's going all over the United States trying to tell people that his probiotics, make a big difference and this and that. Jeff completely destroyed him from the stage. And the sad part is, nobody in the audience realized what Jeff was saying. It took me coming on during my talk to explain this. I said, there's a big lesson here for everybody, that you need to understand that Jeff is telling you that light, not food, determine how it goes. Why is this important for you to hear? Because it goes right back to that big question you asked me before about melanopsin. Okay? That third eye on your skin is the key. That can override many mistakes you make through other parts of your body. And the Hadza and the Maasai are perfect examples of that. And in my country, everything is so artificial now that we will never see these effects. But guess what? You guys in Africa, and I know you're at the bottom tip and Egypt's at the top tip, you would be very wise to look at that middle part of your country and understand that probably the number one thing that really hurts Africa is all the social bullshit that you guys tolerate over there. And your country right now, to me, is completely psychotic. I think if Nelson Mandela was alive today, he would be appalled at what's going on in your country. But I truly hope that people begin to pay attention to the people in the mid portion of your continent, because those are the people that probably can lead the rest of the world into realizing that the things that we're embracing and calling progress now is not real progress. I think if the African people didn't have all the civilization, political, and social problems they do on their continent, they would actually be the leaders in the world in terms of longevity and life, because they live a relative wild existence. The only people that really do this, not the people on the top of the continent or the bottom, but it's the people in the middle. The problem that is destroying them is all the civil wars that you guys have had in the last, 50 to 100 years.
Yeah.
But the thing is, the Hazda and the Masai are still the greatest teachers on this planet, in my opinion. And the thing is, you have to have the mitochondrial perspective. What I say to that is you have to put Windex. I don't know if you have that in South Africa. We have Windex. Put it on your eye and scrub the dirt clean of what you believe, because guess what? These people, the way they live, can teach you a lot about how to maintain your health and change the people around you that care about you.
And it's correct, because a lot of these things, a lot of us do it intuitively. I mean, you tell a story a lot about Ben and how with his grounding and rock climbing, and even with, and I was mentioned earlier about your wife looking fantastic. I wasn't really focusing on her physical appearance. I was focusing on this glow that she has coming from a picture, and this genuine smile. And so my wife mentioned about that with me. I'd do this fake smile years ago, but you could see I was sad, kind of thing. But it came back to her. She intuitively did these things, and where she was a professional tennis player before she met me. She was in the sun morning, day, and night. She was lots of sun. She's vegan though, but she would tan naked. She would love, her favorite thing was beach tennis. She'd be on the beach. She would do CT in the ocean afterwards, and she was flourishing. She was doing really well. Then she met me, and I got ill, and I sort of pulled her down. And she would say, these hacks I do kind of thing, it's just a band-aid. The stress in her life, a problem is me. And sort of, when I had my stroke at the beginning of the year, and I had my 2 kids, and I make that choice myself. Screw all this other crap. I need to do stuff to fix myself so that I can be there for my children. And I mean, my wife, I had in this demonstrating by taking me going to the ocean every day, fishing the sunrise, and I'm wearing my Speedo, and I've got my beanie. The water's about 10 degrees or lower, so it's below 50. And she starts seeing sort of these changes in me, this strength that comes from getting more sun. And then now she's starting to also start adapt and do those more things. There's been a fight with her because, I myself, I see my kids and I'm saying, look, I need to get them in the sun more. I don't want the sunblock. I don't want this other crap. I want them to flourish. And, by doing that, even though, we're doing the CT and it's winter, everyone says, cover your children up, put warm clothes. I'm saying, no, let them have the sun, have a bit of cold exposure, and they're not getting sick. They flourish. They're much stronger and growing better.
You need to teach them why that's the case. And, there may be people listening to this that don't know why that's the case. Because when an uncoupled haplotype, which is what you guys are, go into cold water, what does it do? It causes more heat release from the mitochondria. That heat release squeezes the respiratory proteins closer together, makes you more thermally efficient. So guess what? It works exactly the same way a thermostat works in a house. So exposing yourself to cold actually increases more heat release from you. So that's a good thing. And
exactly.
When you're an uncoupled haplotype, which most people in South Africa are, I would say not most people, but probably at least 50%. Your country is a little bit different than most other countries in the African continent, because most of the coupled haplotypes in the world come from Africa. And those are called L0s. The north and south part of your country, radically different, because most of the people that are like in Zimbabwe and in South Africa have Northern European haplotypes outside of the native peoples that are there. The key thing is you can get a huge benefit from that. And it turns out the reason you change is cold as well as equatorial sunlight has the same ability to raise dopamine level. And how do you become aware to change more is when your dopamine level rises.
Yep.
So you have a program in you because, South Africa is further away from the equator than normal in Africa, but it's not terribly far away.
Yeah, we range from about 26 to 55.
Right. And that's what I was going to say. You're pretty much almost like New Orleans. And the key is that you have programs built into you that work with temperature. And when the cold goes down, you can still improve yourself. And this is really important for people to understand. Now, the corollary is, I don't know how many people you have listening to your podcast who live in the tropics area of Africa, cold thermogenesis for them is not very good. And they're the rarest of rare birds on this planet, because if you have an L0 haplotype, you usually have really dark skin. Dark skin is designed to work with strong sunlight. So most of their programs that are based in them are really good. The problem is, and I'll tell you this, because I didn't realize we're going to talk about all these African connections, but it's important. We have a big African connection in the United States that we're seeing develop right now in Detroit, Michigan. We have a lot of Somalis that emigrated to Detroit, which is a very high latitude. It's like 42, 43. The Somalis, when they're in Africa, don't even have a name for autism. Do you know that within one generation of them coming to Detroit, that almost every single Somalian family in the United States has an autistic kid? And it's usually the reason why is because they are very dark people. I mean, they're so dark, they're purple. And the reason why is they live in equatorial area to protect themselves from the sun so they can stay in the sun a long time. Detroit has no sun. I mean, it's really a really bad environmental mismatch when you have dark skin. So this is one of the things that's a huge problem. It's also a problem why the African-American people we have in the United States, they tend to have many diseases that are related to a lack of solar exposure, because what is their skin and their mitochondria built to work best with? Equatorial sun. There's no place in the United States where we have equatorial sun. In fact, where I live in the tip of Florida is as close as it gets. That's only 24 or 28 latitude. That's not good enough. When you have dark skin, you have to be inside the 20s with Capricorn and Cancer. And the key is that's a big, big issue. The only way to overcome that is to be in nature longer. So like the true Africans in South Africa, they can get away at your subtropical latitude with their dark skin, provided they're out in the sun a lot. But over the last 100, 125 years, people don't walk around naked anymore like they used to. And that is one of the problems that leads to the diseases of civilization. And this is why, I try to explain to people, you need to look at the nuance from the United States and also the nuance from Africa, because when you begin to put the pieces together, you start to say, so this is how it works. This is really, really important. And these things from a public health standpoint are incredibly important because, as you said before, the application of this information is ridiculously simple. Lions and hippos get it. Your instinct is based on how high or low your dopamine level is. And the problem is when your dopamine level drops, you lose your instinct. In other words, you lose the essence of what your DNA allows you to be. See, lions and hippos in equatorial Africa don't have to worry about that. Their skin and their eyes are always getting the signal from nature. They do what lions and hippos do. We don't, though. We don't live the way we do. There's very few people left in the world, humans, that truly are wild. We can find them in the Amazon jungle. We can find some of them, like the Maasai and the Hasda. Even they have been polluted by Western civilization because people like Jeff go to visit them. But on a relative basis, they live much more wild than, say, somebody in New York City. And the thing is, we have to get the people in New York City to realize the lessons that the Africans can teach us. And the problem is, this story, in my view, in science, is not being broadcast enough. Yeah. Okay, I don't know how it is in Africa, but I think if I was a political leader in that continent, I would do everything possible to make the equatorial zone of Africa the giant incubator for teaching modern humans why we're so sick. Why? Because I believe you could take your sickest population in South Africa, move them up with the Hasda, and watch what happens within 5 or 6 years. All of a sudden, the diabetes, the neurodegeneration, all the things that we struggle with in a Western civilization materially vanish.
Yeah, and we understand with non-native EMF and blue light that it's the non-linear major contributor to obesity, diabetes, and other Neolithic diseases. I mean, diabetes now has been upgraded to the second leading cause of death in South Africa. But like you mentioned earlier, the whole Bill Gates thing, there's this issue on attacking influencing and marketing the social factors. Because like when I'll be in doing my CT in the ocean, and everyone's dressed up, and I'm going through the water, and I'm swimming there, and people think I'm crazy. I mean, a couple of times, people even call law enforcement, to check, is there something wrong with me? I'm the only guy here, and I'd explain. I'd look at them. I'd say, listen, you've got people running on the beach, even like I said, dark-skinned people, and I'd say, am I the crazy one? They're the crazy ones who are wearing sneakers while running on the beach sand. And
Right.
why they focus on wearing the latest fashion clothing, covering their entire bodies, instead of being exposed to the light. And, and this is what happens.
You should tell the law enforcement people when they come to talk to you, say, officer, can you tell me any live animal on our planet that comes out of its mother's vagina that has sunglasses, sneakers, or clothes on?
Exactly. And that's what I explain. They get lost.
We're the only one, though. And, what I tell people, this is what I do in my clinic. I give them, to get this point across to them, this is what I tell my patients. I said, look, if me and your wife went to your backyard and put an orange tree in the backyard, but then your wife came and put a tarp over it, would we get any oranges? And all of them get it. They're like, no. I said, so why do you think wearing the clothes that you have on for the last 60 years had no effect on your vitamin A and vitamin D cycle? And that's the reason why your vitamin D stinks. But yet, you live at the 28th latitude, which in the United States is pretty good. We never lose vitamin D at this level. But many of my patients come in, and their levels are horrible. I tell them why. Because you lived your life with a tarp over you. And when it's hot out like it is right now, right around the summer solstice, what do Southerners in the United States do? They go inside air conditioning, which is exactly the wrong thing to do. And when you explain this to people in this way, they begin to start to realize that the way we think about things, this is what the USB drive from civilization is, and what's done it to us, that's caused us to have these problems. And this has persisted for about the last 150 years in human history on every continent. We think we are smarter because of the technology that we've created. And it turns out we're not really understanding how the technology we've created has got in between the wireless connection that we need to maintain with the earth and the sun.
Sort of shifting also, probably that some of our listeners are doctors and surgeons. And, we're going to sort of cover, I know you've covered before sort of your man cave and man kitchen, but covering, with them and some of the questions I've gotten is that, in your residency, I mean, you have 7 years plus where you're in this toxic and blue light environment, and you got all these different Wi-Fi and magnetic fields and different things. And, this puts quite a strain on you and your mitochondrial ability to function. And, we understand with allopathic medicine and algorithmic medicine that, doctors aren't reading the right journals. I mean, they don't necessarily want to learn physics, or they don't necessarily have the dedication to put the time in. And even with, these studies that come out that have been for years, it takes 20, 25 years to go from desktop to practice. And so in my thesis, to try and get data, either was too out of date or difficult to get hold of. And I had to rely a lot on actually, interviewing doctors and, them sharing their case files of, seeing this abundance of what's happening to their patients. But at the same time, they're also being affected where they're having this pattern where they're doing these mistakes in surgery, but they don't understand how they made the mistake. I mean, they something that's a normal standard protocol, their mind is going blank and they don't understand how they're doing it. And, you explain with the Hippocratic Oath, you do your duty to protect your patients, but more importantly as a doctor, your oath is to protect yourself first and put together these different learning and hacks at home to balance yourself out so you don't make mistakes.
But that's not how doctors are trained. See, that's the disconnect between the public mindset and what being a doctor really is. You have to realize, I did 2 residencies, so my decade in blue light was actually closer to 15 years, okay, not 7. And if I didn't go through that, into that blue shifted nighttime life, I don't think I ever figured all of this out. And it turns out, in medicine, I'm at the top of the pyramid as a neurosurgeon. And most of the time, what I call obedient idiots, which are patients, get hurt, it happens usually at nighttime, not in the daytime. Very rare. It's in the daytime. So we have to help the people that are hurting themselves the most with bad ideas. And once you begin to realize that as a doctor, and once you get enough clinical experience after your residency, and you start to realize that you're not solving any chronic diseases, all you're doing is putting Band-Aids on huge problems. In fact, some of the Band-Aids that we give people are actually making them even worse. That's when you have to make the decision as the physician to examine what you were taught. Was it exactly true? Now, for a researcher like you, even the public, but I would tell you for all the physicians, I'll give you a perfect example. This book right here. You see it on the video. This is Fritz Hallwich's book. Every doctor who's listening to this podcast needs to go buy that book. The book is a compilation of what Fritz Hallwich, he was an eye doctor, learned from 1940 all the way up to 1979. Why is this important? Most doctors listening to this know that ophthalmologists make most of their money by doing cataract surgery and putting intraocular eye lenses in. Fritz existed at a time where we didn't have intraocular eye lenses. So what was he able to teach himself and teach other doctors? What humans were like once they took a cataract out and left it out and let full spectrum sunlight get in. The dramatic changes that he found. In that book that I just showed you, that's literally 100 pages, physicians in Africa will never, ever be able in the modern world to see what he found, because now we always put an intraocular lens in there. You'll never see the effect. And the thing is, most physicians don't even question this because the paradigm of belief in allopathic medicine and ophthalmology is when you take a cataract out, you have to put a new lens in. Well, the question you need to ask yourself as a physician is the new lens we're putting in exactly like the lens we took out? And it turns out it's not. And guess what? Does that little change make a difference? When you realize what's in this book, then you realize wearing glasses and then wearing sunglasses is even worse. And the thing is, how do you get physicians to realize the life that they've lived, which is a circadian shifted life, when they have the realization that's affecting their health, then they begin to realize, what good am I as a physician to anybody else if I keep living this life? That's the realization that I had about 5 or 6 years ago. I was able to come up with a bunch of hacks to help myself, but I came to a point about 5 years ago that I realized that there was no hack that I could do to actually protect myself anymore. So then I had to make the tough decision that I was going to have to find a place to be able to be a neurosurgeon and not take call and not work on weekends, to have time for me to get back in nature, to refix the clocks in me so that I could teach the rest of the world kind of what I've learned over my last 25 years being a physician. Because ultimately, what does the word surgeon mean? It means to teach. And the thing is, most surgeons who you talk to, if you would have talked to me 15 years ago, I would have said this. No, the surgeon's job is to cut. That's what we're taught in medical school, okay? What we're taught in medical school is part of the problem. I mean, right now we have nurses, we have doctors, the people that they work for, they subjugate their health to take care of people for profit in our country. What people don't realize is if people want to kill themselves at night doing the things they shouldn't be doing, let them do it. That is decidedly not what a physician is taught in medical school. But if a person wants to harm themselves, once they understand what blue light and what technology does, and the only way they're going to know this, my friend, is for the second question that you asked me about this melanopsin story. That information is absolutely critical for every physician to get. Why? Because it ruins every peripheral clock chain mechanism. Every disease you learned about in medical school links back to this system. And I had no way to prove it until December of 2017. Now that paper is out there. People need to understand it. And my belief is very similar to what you said earlier. It's going to take most physicians, most surgeons everywhere in the world, 20 to 25 years to get the information that you and I are talking about on this podcast right now. That's the reason why the public who's listening to this can't rely on politicians, countries, governments, or doctors to get the message. Your job is to realize the data is already at hand, okay? There's going to be a tipping point for physicians. 1%, 2%, 3%. People may hear this in your country and say, you know, I didn't even know about this melanopsin thing. I didn't even know it was in the eye. I had no idea it was in the skin. So they're going to go back and read this. They may pick up Fritz Hallwich's book and read how blue light can affect the eosinophil count in your patient. That's a huge big deal in Africa. Unbelievable, because of the parasitic infections you have. Most doctors learn about eosinophils and parasites. Well, it turns out, guess what? Blue light, especially the flicker effect of blue light, causes your eosinophil count to drop to the ground, to make you more susceptible to getting parasitic infections. What's the number one parasitic infection in your continent? Malaria.
Yeah.
Isn't it interesting how Equatorial Africans very rarely get malaria, but when you put a white boy from New Orleans in there, they get it like that.
Yeah.
There's a reason for that. And the thing is, no one in your country and hardly anybody in my country realize that the effect is mediated through light. And I think when we do podcasts like this, especially when we're talking about different continents, you understand I've maybe spent a week of my life in Africa, but yet I seem to know a lot about Africa, don't I? Why? The reason for that is because your continent is sitting right in the right place for us to do some pretty amazing studies on humans. And my country happens to have their head up their ass because they think that modern Americans are wild humans. They're not even close. They're the biggest collection of zoo animals on the planet. So anytime you do a randomized controlled clinical trial on those animals, you're never going to get the same result that you would get in Equatorial Africans. And the problem is light is never controlled in any big pharma study. And that's on any continent. That includes yours.
Mm-hmm.
So the thing is, what are we taught in medical school? We're taught that it has no scientific validity if it's not done in a randomized controlled clinical trial. What did I just tell you before? If you don't have the proper light controls and you're using zoo animals, how accurate are your randomized controlled clinical trials, which is what we're taught to believe in medical school? Could that be the reason why that we have the obesity crisis, the diabetes crisis, the suicide crisis, the opiate crisis? My answer to you is abso-freaking-lutely. And the thing is, until doctors on your continent and my continent begin to realize that this effect comes from these melanopsin receptor, both in the eye and the skin, we're never going to solve this problem. We're going to still be confounded why in 1900 in the United States, colon cancer was the 37th leading cause of cancer. Today in the United States, it's number 2. So if you believe Darwin, if you believe in evolution, explain to me how in 2 generations it went from 37 to 2. I'm going to tell you what happened in 1900. Tesla and Edison, then we added on technology.
Yeah. And
that's the reason it occurred. And now we have 320 million people in our country. And I venture to say 90%, maybe even 95%, use technology daily over 4 to 6 hours a day. That didn't exist in 1900. The only thing that happened in 1900 in my country is rich people in New York City had incandescent light bulbs. That was it. The rest of the country was still using kerosene or fire. That's the problem. And you guys, as far as I'm concerned, the Equatorial Africans, I know they have cell phones. Jeff told me that some of them and some of the Maasai even have cell phones now. But the effect is still much less than it would be, say, for a guy who works on Wall Street in New York City. And the thing is, they're the last hope for us to get this message to your medical school, guys. I mean, you guys have an amazing guy in your country, Tim Noakes, who just went through an amazing, process in South Africa where they try to take his license away. He focuses more on the food. And I've told Tim many, many times that, Tim, you went from one angle to the other, where he believed the high carb diet was fine. Now he knows that a ketotic diet is better. And I keep telling him, Tim, you're going to become a black swan eventually and realize that it's the sunlight that really drives this process. And the reason why Tim believes what he believes today in South Africa is because now most South Africans use technology. So guess what? They have to eat ketotic because they're never outside in the light. And I keep telling Tim, he's making a mistake, big mistake, that he doesn't realize that this environmental change that's gone on in his country is what has made food that's made from carbohydrates appear toxic. It's not that they're toxic. It's that the light environment that this melanopsin system controls via your mitochondria destroy melatonin, and this ruins your mitochondrial function. And when it ruins that, what do mitochondria do? It takes electrons and protons from food and deciphers the information in there. Well, if that system's broken, there's no way that you can decipher the message appropriately. That's the reason the disease occurs. It's not that the food is bad. It's that the system is completely broken that understands that.
And I mean, with Tim Noakes, a recent one of his lectures at the university here, the students were telling me how, yes, he focused on the ketonic part and he says that vegetables are bad. And again, with understanding the whole aspect with light and that, and I look at him, and you said it by many of the famous guys in the paleosphere. You look at Tim's physical appearance and his movement and performance, you can see that he's blue light hammered. I mean, he's blue light toxic with the things he does, and his body is showing it.
But that's the reason he has the belief that he has, and I want you to understand it. It doesn't mean Tim's a bad guy.
No.
Tim is advocating for his country right now, a smart thing. Why? Because I look at South Africa, it's probably the most developed nation in Africa. They're making all the same mistakes that we're making in the United States, just not to a greater degree. But I believe that's the reason why some of the politics that's now going on in your country is happening. I also believe it's why the politics in my country is beginning to happen. It turns out where you're most blue light toxic tends to be where your dopamine level is the lowest. And this is the reason why thinking gets disrupted. And the key is, if Tim ever gets the message that food is electrons and protons, he's going to understand why he's advocating for a low-carb, high-fat diet. It's because he is correct, because we're blue light toxic. We're no longer operating under the power of the sun. And it turns out carbohydrates become A-OK in the season they grow it, provided your skin and your eye are assessing and assimilating the sun. In South Africa, that's no longer the case. That's the reason why you get the false sense of reality that carbohydrates are a real problem when they're not. We have the exact same problem in the United States. And do you know how hard it is for me to say this? Because I appear like a salmon swimming upstream. Everybody believes the opposite, and I don't. And it's the reason why is because none of them, and I mean none of them, these people are smart in the paleosphere, and Tim is very smart as well. None of them understand this melanopsin system, not one. And they don't understand how it's such a game changer in terms of how it controls melatonin and how melatonin controls those two programs in mitochondria. That is the job of a black swan, to get people, and I have no illusions. There's about 8 billion people on the planet. I don't want everybody to listen to me, because guess what? That's not how evolution works. You know how evolution works? Change happens to a small group. The small group that adapts then takes the next level forward. Everybody else gets taken out by evolution. And this sounds really harsh when you say it to a group of physicians, but I'm telling you, it's the reason why lions always go after the smallest animals and the ones that are hurt. That's how evolution works. If you don't get the message that nature's giving you, you get taken out. You get taken to the woodshed. And I have no illusions that this message isn't for everybody, because you know what? At least my experience on social media is when someone comes on my Dr. Jack Kruse Facebook page or on my site and they say this is too hard to learn, and I just say to them, that mindset is so low dopamine, I can't even tolerate it. I usually just delete them. And the reason I do that, and it may be, some people may look at it as arrogant to do, I look at it like this: I have no time to waste in getting people to realize that they're their own worst enemy, because they cannot or do not have a high enough dopamine level to assimilate it. The thing is, animals get this message loud and clear. They're able to do this just by being in nature. Most animals are relatively high dopamine state. They know how to take care of themselves there. Humans are the only animal on this planet that need to be told how to eat. I've actually said that to Tim many times. I said, Tim, have you ever actually thought about how ridiculous it is to have to teach a human how to eat? Do we have dietitians for hippos and lions? No. How about for the Nile crocodiles? No, they wait for the wildebeest to come. The thing is, it's amazing to me that people don't realize the science behind nature is very complex. That's quantum mechanics. But life, the actual application of this information is ridiculously simple. That's what the Egyptians were trying to tell future humans through the pyramids and through the Sphinx. The problem is we're not getting it. The thing is, when I talk to a group of physicians now, and they're like, Jack, it's really that simple? Like, we need to see the morning light, live mostly in the sun, and make sure we turn the blue light off and the technology at night? I'm like, yeah, that's pretty much 90% of the game. If you can get that right, you can get a lot of people healthy. It's so simple that they don't believe it. Do you know why? Because everything they learned in medical school is so complex. There's no way this could work. And then when they try it, and remember, when you gave my bio and intro, you said that I started this out as a skeptic. I didn't believe anything I'm sharing with you today. I believe that this was interesting. These were interesting observations I made. When I did that first biohacker myself, I was 100% complete skeptic. I hope everybody that listens to this who is a physician, a surgeon, or a healthcare practitioner, or a nurse, or even this politician who thinks he can change things from social norms, realizes that issue, you need to go into this as a skeptic. But for that politician to say to you, we need more study, no, my friend, the studies are done. You need to connect the dots. In other words, stop being a lazy politician. Stop being the lazy public. Stop being the lazy physician. Your job is to connect the dots that are already in the literature. I've already talked about numerous papers, where they all came from and how they fit. You can go back and read this. I told you about Hallwich. There's plenty of other books that I can tell you. Here, read this book. Here's another one. I just thought about it. It's sitting next to me. Look at that. That's Roland Van Wyck's book that tells you how every cell in our body releases extreme low frequency UV light. That should immediately ask you the question if you're a physician. Wait a minute. Jack, every cell releases extreme low frequency UV light? Didn't the dermatologist and ophthalmologist tell us that UV light's bad for us? Yes, I know you learned that. I did. Turns out that's bullshit too. Guess what? That book is a 125-year treatise on basic science that nobody in medical school ever read. They didn't even know it was there. And if you don't believe me, the bibliography is almost 40 pages long. How do you like that? So the thing is, when you focus in on the wrong things and not the correct things, guess what happens to you as a physician? You get led down a path that the paradigm can make money from, but your patients won't get well. And what's the proof that I'm right about this? I can't say anything for your country because I don't know the data well for the public, but I can tell you about the United States. We are the richest, sickest country in the world because we've adopted technology massively since 1960. And guess what? If you look at all of our data from epidemiology, everything has gotten worse since we embraced television, computers, cell phones for communication. It is absolutely the toxin, the pox that we have brought to our people. And until we get the message, and it's going to be a tough message for this country to swallow because our entire economy is based on it. In fact, we're trying to export all of this to the world. The United States effectively is what made South Africa sick. Yeah. That's how I look at it. That is absolutely how I look at it. And I don't say this because I'm anti-American. No, I'm all about capitalism. I'm all about the things that our government is doing from a political standpoint today. But I'm not about paying for it And it's almost like giving people chemotherapy all over the world when they open up their new iPhone. They think they got something great. Or when they get new sunglasses.
It's not just the iPhone, it's the thing of, like you know what, each person has 7 light emitting devices around them, and they want to play catch up to being the coolest country in the world.
Right. Well, I know that's how it is in Africa, because I mean, when I've talked to, I have a couple of Nigerian friends who are neurosurgeons, who are related to royalty, and it's amazing to me what the native Afrikaans look at. They want all this technology. No, I want to be a native Afrikaan. I want to be the Hazda. I want to be the Maasai. Why? Because they're using technology via nature the way it should be used. Because to me, the most fulfilling life is not what's found in the United States, where you have a disease of consumption. You get to the age of 50 or 60 years old and you're on more medications than you can afford food. That to me is no way to live. I think being able to live off the land and being able to do it in a way that's smart is great. There is a problem. There is an inflection point. One of the things that I think has been a benefit for human, or I should say American technology prowess, we just have to realize that we've gone too much to one side. You do need probably to use a little bit of technology in order to have forward progress. But the problem is, the way the system is built, we can use blue light in a bad way and still do well if we're able to provide people time. Like, for example, I think one of the things that we should do in the United States to help young people and to help our best researchers is to make sure that they don't come to work till 9 o'clock in the morning. Why? Because that way they have 2 to 3 hours, and that should be their time to see the sun. I also think that everybody should be given breaks during the day. And I think if we're going to put people in these big Google factories, these factories should have windows that open up. It's amazing to me in hospitals and technology companies, all the windows, you can't open them.
Yeah.
What does that mean? You can never get full spectrum light in. Think about how crazy that is based on some of the things we do. And we do that because of convention. Because what do physicians believe? Oh, well, you're going to get bad bacteria in from outside. No, that's not true. In fact, UV light kills all bacteria.
Yeah.
One of the big problems in the United States and in Africa now, I've mentioned this to so many infectious disease doctors, is tuberculosis. It's making a comeback.
Yeah.
You know what kills TB? UV light. I challenge anybody to go to Equatorial Africa and find me somebody with active TB. It's going to be pretty rare. It's usually somebody that's living an indoor existence using blue technology. Those are the same people that get it here in the States. It's a disease of darkness where you bring light to the darkness. And we learned that in the UK in the 1890s. Those are the people that got bad TB. And people don't realize it. Here in the States now, you have to be placed on 5 different drugs. In Africa, what do? They put people outside. Which one's more expensive? Which one is more effective? How's that? That's the crazy part. Being in the sun, which is free, but see, that's a bad message. All the doctors that are listening to this are going, maybe that's the reason why we don't do it. And that would be, at least in our country, that's true. You can't make any money putting people in the sun. That's not the way the system is built. But you need to realize as a physician that just about every disease, and this is a statement I'm going to make to the physicians, and maybe I'll share this with you on my website so you can put it in the show notes. There are several studies out there that show that all-cause mortality, just so I'm clear for the public listening to this and the doctors, that means every disease on the planet, okay, it's been shown to be lowered by the sun. I want you to think about the magnitude of that statement. That is a study that's been done. Every time I sit down with a skeptic dermatologist or ophthalmologist, I give them 3 or 4 of these papers, and I said, explain to me based on what you learned in medical school. And they're just like, they're absolutely stunned. And you know what the key thing is? Almost, I'd say 99.9% of those 2 professions have never read those papers. They're never presented in medical school. Ask yourself why. But yet, it's published. It's out there. And when I share it with the lay public, like a guy like you, people are like, why aren't doctors talking about this? I can tell you the reason why. It's very simple. If people really got the message that lions and hippos got, we need a lot less doctors.
That's true. And the other issue with it as was like, even you experienced in your life and my life, is that you have to be able to experience something really bad in order to know it's really good.
Absolutely.
And I found, your material and the way you take these papers and connect the dots and put it in a new resonant language. I mean, I found to be worked very well as school curriculum. I mean, my daughter, my son, my daughter's 2.5, my son's 1.5. I teaching the elements of it, they get it. And they are able to apply it and explain it and say, okay, we're going to do this, or I want to go to the beach now. Like she says, sun's coming up, or sunset's coming, we're going now.
Right. And, well, see, the thing is, that's the amazing thing. I always tell people, pay attention to kids, because you know what? They have not been polluted with the ideas of civilization. They get polluted by mom and dad and by school when they get there. But I've never met a kid endogenously that likes vegetables, okay, ever. Most kids they're not into it. And yet, no physician has ever asked the question, why is it that universally kids hate vegetables? Well, it turns out when you eat vegetables solely, you can't myelinate your brain. What is really the job of a child to become an adult, to survive? They have to myelinate their brain. It turns out that they need protein and fat to do that. So the kids are very wise. The problem is none of them know that's the real reason why they hate vegetables. But we need to get back to that. We need to realize that many of the things that we were taught by our parents, by our countries, by our government are absolutely counterintuitive to the laws of nature. And I think that's the reason that I think I've been really successful, because I point all these little different analogies out to people that make them realize, it's true. If we put a tarp over an orange tree, we won't get oranges. And I never thought about us in the same way. And I try to make the point to physicians, look, for you to realize that what you've been taught is a bunch of malarkey, especially when it comes to chronic disease management, you begin to open up a new world. And the thing is, the things that doctors are really good at is like when someone breaks their arm or breaks their leg, we're phenomenal at fixing acute, problems. The thing is, if I can get a physician then to monitor, say, a broken leg, get their vitamin D level, and then up the vitamin D level while they're healing. I've mentioned this to many orthopedic surgeons. When they put a cast on a broken leg, I said, what do you notice about the cast when it comes off? Because it's been covered from the sun. The leg is white, pale, extremely atrophic. Okay? And what's the real goal? The treatment of broken legs has changed quite a bit. Now, in the States, we tend to operate on broken legs faster so that they don't have to be in a cast. They can be in an immobilization device. But what do I tell my patients, like when I operate on them, either for a broken neck or a broken back? I tell them I want them in the sun immediately. As soon as, and the nurses in the hospital are like, what do you mean, Dr. Kruse, you want them to go out in the courtyard right after they recover from anesthesia? And this just happened literally 2 weeks ago. I took care of a guy with a spinal cord compression, took 2 bones out of his neck, reconstructed it. Literally 1 hour after surgery, he was sitting in the courtyard. He actually texted me his picture in his collar outside with his gown off. That's something I never would have done 10 or 15 years ago. And the thing is, this patient went to see 2 other surgeons. He never got told any of this. In fact, they told him that he'd be in the ICU for many days and there was a chance he could be paralyzed. He went home the day after surgery. And I've seen him post-op now. He's about 3 weeks out. He got all of his function back. He's in the sun every day. He wanted to go back to work, and I told him, no. I need you in the sun for the next 4 to 6 weeks. Why? Because the sun here is strong now. I said, I can raise your vitamin D up. I said, you just had a vitamin D operation. I had to cut through your skin to get to your bone and reconstruct it. You need boatloads of sun to recover so that I know that you will never get this problem again. I don't want you ever close to a wheelchair like you were before. This is a guy that barely could stand up the day before surgery. So you need to realize that there's an immense power that we're not using in biology and in medicine. And the thing is, I don't expect any physician who listens to this is going to immediately do what Jack Kruse did, because I didn't do that even when I figured all this stuff out 10 or 15 years ago. It became as I got more wise as a physician and started to read stuff that I was never taught that are published and begin to connect the dots, that's when I decided, okay, I need to adapt and change the things that I do to help my patients better. Because guess what? There's many conventional treatments that you can still do, but as long as you make the key maneuvers to change the patient's environment so that it's more natural and less artificial, then the patients have tremendous improvements.
No, I mean, it's the sun element is exceptionally powerful. Like I said, in your your Vermont talks, you've always incremented it better and better and targeted those key messages for people and how to find the answers and solutions. And yet, like I said, it's so simple. One question I was having separate, this is a separate thing. There's the thing of a hyperbaric chamber and a hypobaric chamber. So one is where there's pressurized oxygen, the other one is oxygen level stays the same and pressure changes. And sort of like altering altitudes, what Wim Hof does with this breathing technique type of in the system. And there was, in Japan, was developed a device, a hypobaric chamber, and they fluctuate the pressure, 250 times. And they actually brought to Africa years ago for Nelson Mandela, and it worked very well with HIV and inflammatory response. But having that pressure and change, stimulate the mitochondria differently, they found worked very well in treating 82 different types of cancer. Where the cancer disappears in under 2 months, just by going for 45 minutes a day. And the same, we also have Paul Hero, who found, by applying a static field, also we can kill the cancer because we're attacking the crust of the mitochondria that it's consuming. And even like when you prescribe or recommend the magnetic code, and Frank Barnes talks about how, when you apply the magnetic static field to deuterium, it shrinks that respiratory protein and it's able to work better in the body processing it. But yeah, I just wanted to get sort of your opinion on the hyperbaric chamber and the benefits when you can't, if you say in the 50th latitude or you can't get that sun, how it's an effective alternative treatment.
Well, everything that you just said, these are what I call observations that give you a small sliver, really, of how mitochondria work and also how deuterium works in your body. And the problem is, from all those observations you made, your job as the black swan mitochondriac is to figure out how all those seemingly incoherent things actually make sense. And that's kind of what I'm teaching people right now. In my quantum thermodynamics series, I'm teaching people how these seemingly disparate observations actually match. Well, it turns out hyperbaric oxygen is a relatively easy one to explain. So most cancers, not all cancers, but most cancers make huge amounts of free radicals. The reason for that is autophagy and apoptosis are broken. So electron chain transport is initially, before the cancer manifests, slow. Turns out electron speed across cytochrome 1 to oxygen in a cancer state has to be very, very high. Okay? That's one of the changes that occurs between mitochondria and the DNA. When the cancer manifests is when you lose the growth control. That's when apoptosis goes away. And it turns out the fastest way to do that is to be solar deficient. Why? Turns out that the VDR receptor, that's the vitamin D receptor, actually inhibits electron chain transport. So that means vitamin D, solar exposure, slows electron chain. The slower it is, the less chance you can lose apoptosis. It's impossible for any human cancer to manifest if apoptosis is intact. So that's the reason why I tell everybody the sun is truly a vaccine of nature for sunlight. Why does this scale to HBO? Well, what people also don't know is that direct solar exposure increased the amount of oxygen in your body through the UV light. And this is through a very complex pathway. It's called the chiral heat effect, okay? You mentioned the Japanese studies when they used a hypobaric, not a hyperbaric. Turns out when you lower oxygen tensions and you have really poor mitochondria, you actually are protecting yourself. That's exactly the reason why people develop sleep apnea. The reason why is they're trying to lower the oxygen tension in their body to deal with their shitty mitochondria they can't fix. Okay? So there are some cancers that you put in a hyperbaric oxygen chamber and you raise the oxygen levels up, that increases electron chain transport. That can make them sicker. That can actually kill them faster. Can make the tumor de-differentiate. In my country, I don't know how it is in yours, but in my country, we have what they call functional medicine doctors who routinely think that giving people HBO is the right thing to do. Those are people that I call dysfunctional medicine doctors because they have no earthly idea how mitochondria work. And it turns out that hyperbaric oxygen is a really bad idea. I happen to have a really good friend that most people know. I've done a lot of podcasts, not podcasts, but I've written articles about him, and we've done a couple of live events. His name is Jeremy Tomley, has cystic fibrosis.
Yeah.
He did a hack about 2 years ago where he used hyperbaric oxygen at his house. He had his own tank, and he found out it made him sicker. Now think about this. This is a disease where you're starving for oxygen. But yet, when he used a machine that raised his oxygen levels up, he got sicker. Do we have another parallel for the doctors listening to this? They're probably perking their ears up now. People with ARDS who don't have cystic fibrosis. When we put an endotracheal tube down there, when we raise their oxygen levels up, what happens? They get multi-organ system failure. They get sicker. Why? Because anybody with ARDS has defective mitochondria throughout their whole system. Why? Because autophagy and apoptosis are broken. So here's the key that you need to understand. The use of a hyperbaric oxygen chamber can be deadly when you're making shit tons of free radicals. It tends to be very helpful when the problem is autophagy is intact and apoptosis is intact, but you just don't have as much high oxygen tension. In other words, your heteroplasmy rate's on the way up, but it's not past that big window. That's when it can help. And the problem is that nuance often gets lost to the patients or the clinicians that are doing it because they look at the world like a hammer and a nail. They don't understand how these dynamic pieces fit. I can tell you, most physicians are stunned to know that UV light increases venous O2 saturation. This is the reason why airborne diseases within the equatorial regions of Africa are much lower than they are when you go further away from the equator. And it's a really, really important thing to understand. The way you use hyperbaric oxygen needs to be very, very measured. And I personally believe that you need to be a quantum clinician and you need to have extreme knowledge about how a mitochondria work before you apply something like this. It's much more effective for you to use the sun than it is a hyperbaric oxygen chamber because the sun gives you another protective effect that the hyperbaric oxygen chamber can never give you. What is that? That VDR receptor slows electron chain transport. The other thing that slows it that I think most people know about, it was given the Nobel Prize in 1992, which is nitric oxide. What does nitric oxide do in cytochrome 4? It slows electron chain transport. What makes nitric oxide in the body, my friend? UVA light. So it turns out UVA and UVB have a braking mechanism in the inner mitochondrial membrane. And the thing is, most physicians have never taught this. And the irony is, here you and I are talking about this, and some physician's going to say, I need to disprove Jack. They're going to go back and look and see that the 1992 Nobel Prize was given for nitric oxide. And what does that do? It vasodilates blood vessels to come to the surface so the red blood cells can be more irradiated. What's the porphyrin in red blood cells that most people should know if they're a physician? It's called hemoglobin. What does it absorb best? 250 nanometer light, which is UVC light, all the way up to 600 nanometers, which is red light, and there's a strong cutoff. Doesn't absorb anything past that. So what does that mean? Red blood cells are effectively UV and infrared A light ferries that bring that information to mitochondria. That's exactly what's happening. And that information that's buried in that light is incredibly important because it controls the information quanta that keeps your mitochondria heteroplasmy low. That's what keeps your patients alive the longest. That's the key. And these little nuances are exactly how this works. And it turns out that oxygen is the main terminal acceptor for electrons in mitochondria. The input is NADH. NADH is a fluorophore protein. It's made from tryptophan, which is an aromatic amino acid that also absorbs UVC light all the way up to about 300 nanometer light to be programmed. Most physicians don't even know that tryptophan can form NAD positive, which is a thermodynamic couple. That protein at cytochrome 1 absorbs electrons from carbohydrates. Its spectrum is about 340 nanometer light. So that's UV A light. So you go between UVA light and oxygen. That determines the redox potential. The electrical difference between NADH and oxygen, what is that designed to be around? About negative 400 millivolts. So that's what optimal redox potential is, say, in equatorial Africa. Where heteroplasmy begins to show up is around negative 200, negative 250. That means that you can't use cytochrome 1, you have to use cytochrome 2. That goes back to your countrymen. That's the reason why Tim Noakes believes right now that proteins and fats are the way to go, because most of the electrons and protons enter at cytochrome 2 because cytochrome 1 is so defective. That's the reason why Tim believes what he believes, because he's not a mitochondriac. He does not realize that the redox potential in most people in South Africa has been destroyed because their autophagy and apoptosis doesn't allow them to recycle so they can use from cytochrome 1 to oxygen. This is a very complex question you ask me, and I think you're understanding. When you ask me a complex question, you're going to get a very complex answer. And anybody who is a physician listening to this, you probably have already got the message loud and clear. You need to do a lot better job understanding this than you were taught in medical school, because most of the stuff that I just said to you, all I knew about mitochondria, I knew about the cytochromes, I knew about oxygen. I didn't know about any of the other details that I just told you. I had to learn that over the last 15 years. And I look at it like this: if I can learn it, any of you can learn it.
No, it's true. And I mean, it's going to, like you said, it's can get very complex. I know you said you have to leave in 15 minutes. So I'll give one last simple question, because we don't want you to miss your next appointment. Sort of a personal thing. So with pregnancy in women, because we know in South Africa, C-sections it's marked as a very popular thing. We also know you explain how deuterium, the heads of the babies get bigger in the bodies, and it's created this problem. But as a quick Mito-Hack, one thing is, more sunlight. And the second thing, can one do CT when pregnant?
Yes, you can do CT when pregnant. I'd say it's probably much more effective for an uncoupled woman. But let's take a native African. I'm going to tell them I want them to drive their program more through the sun. So that means while the belly is getting bigger, and I mean the belly, I want the red light exposure from the sun, because that's something we didn't talk about, is the solar spectrum. 42% of sunlight is red. Red penetrates inside the body 10 to 30 centimeters. So guess what? That red light is really important for the fetus to get. So the whole time a woman's pregnant, I would like to see their entire front completely out in some level of sunlight almost every day they're pregnant. And the idea CT, I think CT can be dangerous in an L0 haplotype because they're not built like a Kenyan. The reason why they win all the endurance races all over the world is because if you know anything about Kenya, Nairobi's at 1 degree north, 5,000 feet up in the air. That's the reason why Kenyans are the darkest people in Africa. Why? Because they have to protect themselves from the UV light the most. They do extremely well in hot temperatures and in arid conditions. They are the worst people in the world to do what Wim Hof does, and the worst people in the world to do what I teach people. The program is still in them. They could adapt to it if they go to a high latitude, but will they be able to win the way they win everywhere else? No. In fact, I'll tell you a story you may appreciate. When all the Kenyans come to the Boston Marathon, because, they've won it like the last 20 years. The first week they get to Boston, they always come early. The reason why the first week they come, they always get sick. Because they can't handle the change in the environment. But yet, if you put them in the environment that they're used to, it goes. And if I'm not mistaken, even since we're talking about running, you'll probably appreciate this. You're young, but there used to be a runner, I don't know, like 20, 25 years ago. I think she was from South Africa. Her name was Zola Butt. And everybody, what made her very interesting is that she ran all of her races barefoot. And she was connected to earth. And none of the runners could figure out how she was able to do this. And it was very simple. She actually it was almost like blood doping because she was more connected to the earth. She actually was improving the zeta potential in her blood. She was actually able to absorb more light from the sun as she ran because she was connected. And I was always amazed that nobody put two and two together, why she was able to do this. Because, she's the only person that I know. I think she ran in the Olympics for South Africa, and she did pretty well. She was, I think, top 5 in the world for a long time. But you've never seen that recapitulated in sport. But yet, if you go to inside the tropics, guess what? Almost all the people in Uganda, Kenya, who are not, socialized, they don't wear shoes.
Yeah.
And that's still present. We need to get people back to those kind of situations.
No, well, I mean, I've got loads of questions here, but like I said, you have to go, unfortunately, and I would love to keep you for hours and on. But I'm hoping we can still have you on the show again in the future. So let me just close up. Don't go away. But there you have it, everyone. Jack Kruse, our super dad for today. And one of the key messages, you need to be selfish. You need to focus on yourself. You need to learn on how to improve yourself. And by that, you're demonstrating to be that social catalyst for those around you, to ask questions, to follow you, to challenge you, to question, so that you can change your culture and your environment. And, unfortunately, if the environment that we are creating knocks out most of us, it sucks. But evolution-wise, the few that are remaining and that can hack this environment will lead the next flourishment. Jack, thank you so much.
No problem. Anytime.
For more, visit www.nicheradio.co.za.